Hi, I'm Pastor Ben Miller, and today what we're going to be talking about is whether or not churches should be reopening and the timing of reopening. As we think about now, at least in Pennsylvania, it looks like about a week from now we'll be able to start opening things up again, and just how that interacts, how as believers we should think about this. And really though, what I'm really talking about is how as believers we should view other believers in other churches who may do things, get this, different than we do. Wouldn't that be isn't that just horrible that sometimes we as individuals, God has given us all individuality, that we view things differently. And so kind of the question we're looking at today is to open church or not to open church. So what I want to go really is Romans 14. And what I want to focus on here is, I think there's a couple of things we all need to remember. First off, because of the First Amendment and the reality of who God is and who the church is and the purpose of church and the purpose of government, the government, whether they do or not, really can't tell a church not to meet. Okay? It's not unreasonable for them to say, hey, we think this is what's best, this is what you ought to do, but to use force to bring it about, I don't believe that they should be able to do that. So I know there are some churches that haven't closed, and I don't think that's wrong. I know they're like us, churches who have not had service Sunday mornings, and I don't think that's wrong either. And I think churches, you're going to see it. Some churches are going to open sooner. Some churches are going to really try to, when they open, practice the social distancing and all those things that we're supposed to be doing. There's some churches that might not do it as strict as others. And as believers, I don't think we should be condemning each other, and there'll be people in church who are not ready to come back yet, even when church opens, and you know what? That's okay. And those who are ready and believe it is safe enough to come back, they should not be condemning those who are not ready yet as just fearful cowards. And in like manner, those who aren't ready to come back shouldn't be condemning the other believers as not caring or not loving or not caring if grandma dies or anything like that. So that it is possible to have diverse opinions, and it is possible for each church and each individual to be honoring God if what they are doing is the purpose of honoring God. Okay? And not taking counsel of their fears, or not taking counsel of just their absolute frustration with the situation. Okay? So we're going to look at Romans 14 to talk about this a little bit today. So Romans 14:1 says, "As for the one who is weak in faith, welcome him, but not to quarrel over opinions." So right here we have this point, to not quarrel over opinions. Now, remember, this is Paul's talking to the early church in Rome. We have Jews and we have Gentiles who are all part of the church. The Jews still kind of have this position of, I have to stick to the Old Testament diet. The Gentiles are like, well, we don't actually have to do that. As well as you have Gentiles who say, look, meat sacrificed to idol, we know it's just meat, it means nothing. We can eat it, but at the same time there are Jews and other Gentiles who are like, well, I don't know if we should be able to eat that. And so you have these different opinions. And now notice how Paul addresses the situation, and I think we can draw out principles from this text to even apply to the situation that I've just talked about that we as churches and believers are facing. So verse 2, one person believes that he may eat anything, while the weak person eats only vegetables. Let not the one who eats despise the one who abstains, and let not the one who abstains pass judgment on the one who eats, for God has welcomed him. Who are you to pass judgment on the servant of another? It is before his own master that he stands or falls, and he will be upheld, for the Lord is able to make him stand. So notice, and it's true, I believe God has given responsibility to the local church and local church leaders. That's part of being Baptist, and those of you who want to know more about that can watch my videos on the 8 Baptist distinctives. Okay? But each church is accountable to Christ for how they handle this situation. And if the church leaders and the church members are truly seeking God and are truly doing the best they can to discern the information that's before them, to do what's right before God and glorify to Him and what's best for His people, then we ought not to be judging each other. And we have to understand that the beauty of being individual, God making us individuals, and the beauty of the fact that all us as believers in churches live in different communities that look different, God has given us the ability and the discernment and the authority to make these decisions for what is best for us and our congregations and our families. And that's the beauty of freedom. And you have to understand too, part of freedom is this. You have to be free to make mistakes and make bad decisions. And there's also this reality that we need to realize that it is possible for two churches, even very close to each other in similar communities, or even in the same community, to make two different decisions and still be honoring God. That's actually possible. Verse 5, one person esteems one day as better than another, while another esteems all days alike. Each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. Think the Jews, the early Christian Jews, probably had a hard time breaking with the Sabbath as the day to meet and celebrate Christ, where at the same time you had the early church, especially Gentiles, right, meeting on Sunday mornings, because that's when Christ was risen. And Paul's saying the point isn't so much whether or not you should meet on Sunday or Saturday or Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday, but that you set the time aside, that it is for God and you're doing it for the glory of God. The one who observes the day observes it in honor of the Lord. The one who eats, eats in the honor of the Lord, since he gives thanks to God, while the one who abstains, abstains in honor of the Lord and gives thanks to God. For none of us lives to himself, and none of us dies to himself. For if we live to the Lord, and if we die to the Lord. So then, whether we live or whether we die, we are the Lord's. And so Paul makes it very clear, whatever we do it for the Lord. Because God, first off, is the God of the living, and he's the God of the dead. Because God's the God who raises the dead. So we need not to fear, and we need not to condemn our brothers and our sisters in Christ because they view what's best for their church or their family a little differently than another church. It's okay. We do not need to let this tear us apart as a community of faith. Okay? For this end Christ died and lived again, that he might be Lord both of the dead and of the living. Why do you pass judgment on your brother? Or who do you despise your brother? For we will all stand before the judgment seat of God. We ought not to despise our brothers who make different decisions than we do. If they're making it out of faith, what they believe is right and what is best for their people and what is glorifying to God, then we don't need to judge them, whatever camp you might fall into. For it is written, as I live, saith the Lord, every knee shall bow to me, and every tongue will confess to God. So then each of us will give an account of himself before God. See, let God handle that. If they're doing it with wrong motives, that will come out on the day of judgment. But I do believe it's possible to even have held church throughout this whole thing and still be honoring God. I absolutely believe that. Especially if it was done for the right motives. And I also believe churches were honoring God that closed if they were doing it for the right motives. If they were trying to honor God in what they did. And we have to believe we have to remember God has made us different. He's made us with choice and freedom and the ability to choose. And I just wanted to bring that to our mind, and I want to remind you some of the things that church leaders and churches are wrestling with. There's a lot to weigh. The safety of the congregation versus even the fact that we as people need to get together. Like it is for our mental health that we should get together. God has made us that way. In fact, the whole idea of church is the called out ones. The church is not a building, but it's where it's God's people as a whole, and they gather together. Like that is important. And I would say necessary. Church, I believe, should really fall. I think really does fall in the category of a sustaining work. It is important to our communities, and so people have to weigh this. Leaders have to weigh this, and there's this reality too. We can't. I feel like we can't really trust our government leaders, and even a lot of our government, and even a lot of the medical health. Those in the medical health industry right now, simply because it's become so politicized. I mean, you hear one person over here saying this, and you have one person over here saying the exact opposite, and it just seems that the only thing anybody cares about is this election and how to either how to get people to vote for them or how to cheat to get votes. Like, that's kind of seems like the only thing they care about right now. And so we as believers need to come together, look at the information, and make the best decision which we can. And it's true, I'm not a doctor, and that's part of the reason we closed down. Well, I don't know. I had my doubts, but there's this reality, I'm not a doctor. But the problem we're facing right now is everything's become so politicized that those who are responsible for giving us the correct information can't necessarily be trusted that their motives are correct. And so we as churches have to make decisions based on what's best for our people, and it's going to be different. It just is. Understand, God gives churches freedoms to decide for themselves. It's the beauty of God. He gives us this freedom. And not every church is the same. You know that? Not every church is the same. And therefore, what's best for one church may not be best for another church. And so those are things that church leaders and believers, we have to weigh right now. And they're hard things. And that's why I say, even if your church leadership makes some decisions about how church goes that you're maybe not crazy about, you might be right. I'm perfectly willing to admit that. But we need to be careful because there's a lot of things to think through. And we're only human. And that's why I believe in freedom, because when you just have one person at the top making a decision for everybody, that's kind of a dangerous place to be. That's, I think, the beauty of Christian freedom and Christian liberty, and I think we need to have a lot of grace and mercy and understanding with each other at this time. So just some food for thought I want you to think about. This is Pastor Ben. Live long and prosper.